Today's reading is taken from the book of Daniel, chapter 1, beginning to read at verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off into the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord and king, who has assigned you your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus.
Good morning. It's good to see you. What do you notice about this picture just up on the screen now? It probably doesn't take very long for you to spot the odd one out. There's one that is very different. Well, how about this one? Maybe it's a bit harder to spot an emoji that looks different. As you know, at the moment, we're thinking about people in the Bible who took a risk for God. And today we're thinking about Daniel, thinking about the risk he took of being different. He was the odd one out. Most of us want to blend in. We probably don't want to stand out or draw unwanted attention to ourselves. It would be embarrassing. And in fact, a huge amount of anxiety is felt by people who fear they don't fit in on the grounds of, well, it could be almost anything: race, education, clothes, money, how we look. But there are some really brave human beings. In our world today, there are people who are willing to stand up for ideas like democracy in Hong Kong. They're the odd one out, and it takes real guts. And in the person of Daniel, we meet someone who also felt that pressure, a cultural pressure on him, but he stood up for his beliefs. The background in the story to Daniel is the whole of the people of Israel. They had been slaves in Egypt, and then through God's power they were delivered and entered the promised land. But years later, at the end of their line of kings, they're taken captive once again, not back to Egypt, but now to slavery in Babylon. Psalm 137 is a hymn, a poem of lament from that time. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. That's the hill in Jerusalem. There on the poplars, we hung up our harps. So I don't want to sing any more worship songs, he says. For there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the song of the Lord while in a foreign land? So that's the psalmist's lament. I'm not at home, I'm not at Zion, I'm not back in Jerusalem, and I don't ever want to fit in. I don't want to assimilate to life in exile. That's the challenge for Daniel. He's living in a foreign land, and what sort of man is he to become? And actually what happened to Daniel is in some ways very like what happens to some young Christians, their experience going away to university. Daniel is taken away for 3 years of intensive education. It's a time of formation. Who will he be at the end of it? The exiles are deported, and they have a change of location, of worship, because there's no temple. They have to change their language, their culture, and even their names are going to be changed. We read in verse 7, the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. Hananiah, Shadrach. Mishael became Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. And so they're actually given the names of foreign gods. They're being squeezed into a mould to conform to the new place and culture and religion. And the question is, now they're in Babylon, will they simply assimilate? Will they blend in and, in name, they're Jews, but in practice, they're living as Babylonians? Will they remember who they really are? A chosen race, a holy nation devoted to the one true God? Will they seek to blend in and forget their true identity? Odd one out. Are they willing to risk that, being odd? That's the temptation. Actually, it's always been there. It's happened in the history of Israel's first king. Because God said he was their king. And in 1 Samuel 8, when the people are pleading, Samuel tries to persuade them they don't need a human king because God will be their leader. But this is what the people reply then. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. That's their big plan. Just to be like everybody else. They are too scared, too afraid to be different. So what's the choice that Daniel has? Well, they do have to learn the language. And so here's a picture of their native language, which is Hebrew. And they have to learn this, which is very different, Akkadian cuneiform. But they do it. They become educated in the ways of the Babylonians. For them, though, for Daniel and his 3 friends, the sticking point is food. Because Jews eat a kosher diet. They won't eat just anything. And so over in Babylon, they were probably offered pork and rabbit. Now those are forbidden under Torah. But we read in Daniel 1:8, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He felt it would defile him, make him impure. And so he takes the risk not to conform. He faces the risk of being different from other people. And that's where it really perhaps plugs into our lives and challenges us. Where do you feel that today, if you do at all, as a follower of Jesus? The choices we face may not be so stark or clear for us. But there was one little moment came into my mind as I thought about it. As a family, we've always said grace. We've always said a simple prayer of thanks to God for our food. What do I do when I go to a restaurant? Will I say thanks, as I always would at home? Or do I sort of pretend to drop my napkin and then sort of say a hasty grace under the table? Am I embarrassed, even if it's different? I was in a home group years ago and we went out for a meal, the 12 of us, and I nudged the guy next to me and said, "Why don't you say grace?" And he shot to his feet, held out his hands and prayed the loudest, longest prayer I've ever heard. And I remember making a mental note, well, 2 things. First of all, I was so impressed that it hadn't really crossed his mind that not everyone else in the restaurant was doing it. And the second thing, I would never ask him to do that in public again. Daniel won't compromise. But what are the things for us as followers of Jesus, the things we would never compromise over? I believe in the historic creeds, the creeds of the church. They're not negotiable. The Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed that we recite in some services. I believe that only Jesus puts us right with God. And so I'd always want to treat people of another faith or of no faith with real courtesy and kindness. But in my heart and publicly, I would never say there's another way to be reconciled to God other than through Jesus. As it says in Acts 4:12, there's no other name given among people by which we may be saved. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures." So there are some matters that we might say are debatable, where Christians might genuinely have different equal opinions. But there are other things are of first importance. The things that define us, it means we are Christians. For Paul, that includes Jesus died, was buried and rose again. And that there is no Christian faith without these, he says. Now there is a case, for example, for Christians to be vegetarian. We might argue it on ethical grounds or on environmental grounds. But for me, there'd still be space for personal choice. I don't think you have to become a vegetarian in order to become a Christian. And I'm not. So I think it's an order not of first importance, even if it's a good thing. And compromise isn't always a bad thing. And as the UK heads towards leaving the EU, I personally hope very much that we do find a good compromise, rather than just leave without a deal. But as Christians, how do we decide what are the things we will be radical about? The very word Christian carries so many negative connotations in our culture. If you just look at films, the movies, to be a Christian usually means being a little bit weird, or very weird sometimes. It probably implies that you're homophobic, judgmental, or hypocritical. Now, that's nothing to do with being a follower of Jesus. That's not why I joined up. I'd much rather we were known as a church by the things we're for than the things we're alleged to be against. So I want to leave you with the thought of doing a bit of homework, a challenge to do some further thinking. Perhaps thinking it through by yourself, or maybe in a conversation with other people if you're with them now. So first, what are the things you consider so important to your faith that you are completely willing to be the odd one out? Will you risk being different? Secondly, how do you want your life to be distinctive from our wider culture? 3, how much does it matter to you what other people think? Can we cope with being completely misunderstood? And as an example of that, just in the last week, Archbishop Justin Welby has decided and announced that he's taking a sabbatical, a 3-month break next year. And it's a time away for prayer and study and devotion. And I've seen some horrible things written about him on Twitter because of this. People saying now's not the time to take a sabbatical. But I saw another bishop wrote, much ink and bile is regularly expended in insulting our national church leaders for being godless managerialists. And when they model lives of Sabbath, rest, prayer and reflection, this is how they are treated, often by the same people. So I like the fact that Archbishop Justin has had courage to make time to listen to God. And I hope to grow more courageous myself, and for you too as well. God bless.